We
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of What's Next, New Ways of Engaging Jewish Sources. We're so excited that you could join us today. And thank you for your flexibility as we are working through some scheduling issues. For those of you who are here for our session on the new MFA at JTS in creative writing, that is going to happen next week. And we're going to be very excited to make a big announcement at that time. But this week, I am delighted to be able to highlight a new way that we are bringing text to you, specifically through a Passover reader that just went out last week. And I know some of us are in that place where we're like not quite ready for it to be Passover, but believe it or not, it's coming quickly. And all of the Mishigas that attends it is here too. So more than thinking about all of the intrinsic hardness of switching a kitchen or which food or the hashkaha, all of those crazy questions that also combine with Passover. We're excited that this reader, the Seder's Call Moving Beyond the Table, asks big questions around what's our preparation mentally before the Seder and what are the things we want to take away from the Seder. And I have to say, our speaker today, Rabbi Jan Uhrbach, was one of the many participants for this, but she also was such an amazing thought partner for me, thinking about who we should add in and what sorts of spaces we should fill. So my colleague, Tani Schwartz-Herman, will share information about our reader in the chat, and then we'll look at a very specific piece of that today with Rabbi Uhrbach. I also want to thank Shelley and Larry Gross, who supported the Passover supplement in loving memory of their parents, Lillian and Louis Kohnheim and Joseph Gross. So thank you so much for this support and making this sort of learning available and accessible to our broad JTS audience. So also, thank you to all of you who've made a donation to support this series. If you'd like to make another one, we always accept that. There are also sponsorship levels. Our next series is going to reflect on challenges in Israel on the ground based on the convening that's happening next week at JTS. So keep an eye out for information about that. But we look forward for your continued involvement in our series. Finally, let's get to actually introducing this session. So our program today is Who Shall Cross, a Talmudic Reimagining of the Passover Narrative. As I said, we're going to be hearing from Rabbi Jan Uhrbach. She's the founding director of the Block Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts. And she is really a pillar in our community. She's a phenomenal teacher who brings her kind of love of liturgy and her congregational wisdom. She's a rabbi. She's the founding rabbi at Gesher, the Bridge Shul in Bridgehampton, to our community of learners within the rabbinical school and the cantorial school. Her credits are myriad, including the fact that she's one of the people who's been responsible for the Lev Shalem, Machzor, and Siddur, and all of those pieces that have now been filtering out into synagogues over the past few years. And I'm just really excited. When she brought this text that we're going to be studying today to me, it was so unusual and such a different way of thinking about a Passover experience that I was really excited to be able to share it with our JTS Learning audience. And I'm interested to see what you guys take away from this and to hear how and if you could use this in your Seder. We're going to be sharing our sources on the screen, but also my colleague, Tani Schwartz-Herman, will share them in the chat. And we will be doing a Q&A section a couple of times within the session. So please, if you have clarifying questions, if you have questions about content, if you have questions about anything, feel free to send those to me. I did it again. I did not introduce myself. I'm Ellie Gettinger. I'm the Director of Outreach for the JTS Center for Lifelong Learning, and I'm really excited for you guys to be here. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jan now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad to be able to do this session and to have you all with us. So what we're going to look at is a little piece of Agadah. Agadah is the rabbinic term for the non-legal portions of the Talmud, right? These are the stories, the interpretations. it shares a root with the Haggadah of Passover, right? Haggadah, Agadah, they're from the same root, and it's all about telling the story. Rabbinic, the plural Agadah, the plural is Agadot. The rabbinic Agadot serve a lot of different functions in the Talmud. Sometimes they illuminate the halakha, the law that's being discussed. Sometimes they argue with the law that's being discussed. They show sort of the dark side of what the law is. Sometimes they're just exemplary of like, this is how this is practiced. And sometimes they're just stories while we're talking about so-and-so. Remember this, who said something? Oh, remember that time he did this. So this is a story that, as we'll get into it, is very clearly intended to evoke the Passover narrative, and especially the part of the narrative once we're out of Egypt and we're crossing the sea. So this is the part of it. We would, for example, be reading that narrative in the Torah on the 7th day of Passover. We read about the crossing of the sea, and it's a retelling of the story in a very interesting way. As we sit down at our seder tables, we don't read the Torah narrative, right? We don't read the book of Exodus. We read a brief retelling in Deuteronomy, but basically the point of the seder is to retell the story ourselves in our own words, relevant to our own day. And this, I think, is an example of the rabbis doing just that. Although it wasn't in the context of a seder. So we're going to look at a story from Masechet Chulin. Chulin deals with the eating of non-sanctified meat that is not from the offerings, that is just meat. That's its overall theme. And this is a story about Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. Pinchas ben Yair lived in the late 2nd century in the land of Israel. And he was, quite notably, the father-in-law of the great sage Shimon Bar Yochai. There's actually, in the Talmud, we read that he was the son-in-law, but we have reason to believe that's wrong, and he actually was the father-in-law. So his son-in-law was a great mystic. Pinchas ben Yair was known for being especially righteous and a little bit of an ascetic, just a little bit of his personality. So we'll begin. Here's the story. You have the text if you want to open it yourself, but we have it on screen as well. And it begins as follows. Once Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was on his way to redeem captives. Okay, so that already tells us, there's some relevance tragically in our day, right? That we have captives to redeem. But it already links us a little bit with the Exodus narrative, right? Who's going to get the people out of Egypt? It's the same move. And he came to a river, and the river was called the River Ganai. He said to the river, Ganai, part your waters for me that I may pass through you. Now already, anyone who knows anything about the Exodus narrative, we're hearing already Exodus. A river is parting so someone can cross. That's right. The Sea of Reeds parted, Moses raised his hands, God parted the waters, the Israelites passed through. That's being evoked here. But now what happens? The river said to him, you are going to do the will of your maker. Right? And I, the river, am going to do the will of my maker. As for you, there is doubt whether you will do it or not. Regarding me, it is certain that I will do it. Right? On the surface, and we'll unpack a little later what else this might mean. On the surface, the river is saying, listen, you're going to redeem captives. That's terrific. It's God's will that you do that. Maybe you'll succeed. Maybe you won't. I'm flowing in the way that God decreed me to flow. I'm fulfilling God's will for me, and I am definitely fulfilling that. So why should I part for you on the possibility that you might succeed, whereas I definitely succeed? Okay. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair responds, if you do not part, I will decree that no waters ever flow through you. That's a little chutzpahdik, right? Pinchas ben Yair feels he has the ability to sort of manipulate God's hand, right? If you don't part for me in doing this, you're done. The river parted for him. That's the first part of the story. The next part of the story, there was also present, oh, much better, now he's big enough to see. There was also present a certain man who was carrying wheat for the Passover. In case we missed the earlier reference to redeeming captives and a river parting so people can come through, this guy is on a mitzvah to get wheat so people can make matzah for Passover. Okay, clearly we're dealing with the Exodus narrative retold. And he, Rabbi Pinchas, said to the river, part for this guy too. He's engaged in a mitzvah. The river parted for him. Now we get another part of the story, and this is where it gets really interesting. There was also an Arab accompanying them. The word here is taya'ah, and Rashi says this is an Arab merchant who attached himself to Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair and whoever this other guy is who's getting wheat for the Passover, and is accompanying them. These people are journeying together. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said to the river, part for him too. Lest he say, that he not say, is this how they treat a fellow traveler? The river parted for him. Right. Okay. We'll talk about who this guy represents in the Passover story. Rav Yosef, then, commenting on this story, said, how great is this man? How great is Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair? Greater than Moses. Can you imagine the rabbi saying this? This guy is greater than Moses. How do we know that? Because there, and greater than the 600,000 who left Egypt, there at the Red Sea, the waters parted once. Here, the water parted 3 times. The Gemara then objects. Let's not so fast. Don't be hasty. Let's not yet say he's greater than. Maybe here too, the waters parted only once. Meaning, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair parts the waters. He realizes he crosses. He realizes there are others who have to cross. And to make sure that the river isn't going to close and drown them, he reminds the river, stay open for this guy, stay open for that guy. But it only opened once. And so the Talmud concludes, rather we should say that this man, Pinchas ben Yair, was as great as, was like Moses and the 600,000. All right? That's our story. It's a short little tale in the Talmud. So let me just pause for a second and make sure that we all understand the story. Are there any sort of understanding questions about this story that you're not clear on what something means in it? We'll talk about its larger meaning in a minute, but first, just anything anyone wants to raise right now.
I don't have any questions yet, but please feel free. If you guys have questions, please put them in the up. So there is a question. He said, if you do not part, is that God speaking? Who do you feel Is
No,
this
this is all Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair, right? God is not explicitly mentioned in this story and doesn't appear as a character, right? This is all it's Pinchas Ben Yair who says, if you don't
oh,
part, I'm going to decree that the water will never flow through you again, which, as I said, that's pretty chutzpahdik, right? He's purporting to have the power to speak in a way that sort of binds God, that commits God to a certain a certain action here. Okay, so that's Pinchas Ben Yair speaking. Any other
people
immediate
want to
questions?
unpack the
Yeah,
phrase in Arab, but I know that that's coming still, that we're going to talk about the idea of who the Arab is.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah.
I want to know a little bit, what sort of, does Pinhas Ben Yair, yes, he's uh Yochanan, he's got, where else does he appear in the Agadot? Is this
Um, there's not a ton about him in the Talmud. He's a major character in the Zohar.
hmm,
He's a major figure in the Zohar, which is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and so his Shimon Bar Yochai's father-in-law Pinchas Ben Yair is a major figure. What we know about Pinchas Ben Yair from the Talmud is basically what I said, that he's known for being kind of an ascetic. He's very, very particular. One thing that we know about him is that he refused to accept hospitality for meals from anyone,
hmm.
because he never wanted to be in a position where someone would offer hospitality and feel compelled to serve beyond their means. Right. And so he didn't, and he was always concerned about what, he was very meticulous about the ethics of of his host. Right. So he just didn't accept dinner invitations. We know that about him, but he's not a major, we don't have a lot about him from the Talmud.
So this
Um,
story is kind of interesting in that it's lauding this person who doesn't have, and not even lauding. I mean, it is saying he is not just great, he's greater than Moses. Does this happen a lot in the Talmud as someone who's
no,
not?
right. It's quite a statement that they're making. And it's about this, like, he's a miracle worker, right? He has parted the sea. Who else parts water? Right? I mean, that's Moses did that. Who else does that? It's quite something. And so that's what we know about him. So let's talk a little bit now about who is this Arab merchant accompanying them. We don't know much about who he is in the story. Most likely, in the Exodus narrative, he represents the Erev Rav. We know from the Exodus story that when the Israelites came out of Egypt, we came out with an Erev Rav, a conglomeration of other people outside the Israelite community who came with us. It is not clear who these people were. Robert Alter, the great biblical scholar, says that the words Erev Rav are probably onomatopoetic,
Mm.
right? We should translate sort of like riffraff. They don't have a specific meaning. It's just this like group of people who joined us. Some commentators say they were Egyptians. Some commentators say they were people of other nations who were also in Egypt with us, who came out of Egypt and joined us on the journey. There's a split in the authorities as to whether that was for good or for bad, right? Some commentators blame everything bad that the Jews did later on the Erev Rav. It wasn't really us who committed the golden sin of the golden calf. It was the Erev Rav who instigated it. Other people see the Erev Rav as in very positive light, right? So this Arab probably is intended to evoke the Erev Rav, that we didn't leave Egypt alone. But I want to get into a list a little bit more as we talk about what it means for us for Passover in the retelling of the story. And to get to that, there are two pieces of context that we need to know. Okay. One is the context in which this story appears. The context of this story has nothing to do with Passover. nothing to do with crossing rivers. It has to do with eating untithed produce, and specifically the way that certain animals fulfill the will of God. Right? So we were in our story, if you remember, you look at it, you see that the river says, I'm fulfilling God's will. Right? It's not only human beings. And in the context, if we can pull up the sources and look at the additional source A, this is where our story appears. Rabbi Ze'era, another rabbi, had made the statement that God doesn't generate mishaps through the animals of the righteous, all the more so through the righteous themselves. Meaning, this is a theology that if accidents happen, and someone is the incident, is the one through whom the accident happened, it's because they in some way weren't righteous. How do we know about the animals of the righteous? What are we talking about when we say the animals of the righteous? They tell the story. The incident where Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was going to engage in the redemption of captives, and he encountered the river Kenai. And our story continues. After the telling of our story, the Talmud then continues. After crossing the river, what happened? Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair happened to come to a certain inn, and his hosts, now we remember, Pinchas ben Yair is someone who doesn't like to accept dinner invitations, right? His hosts at the inn threw barley before his donkey to feed the donkey, but the donkey wouldn't eat. And then they sifted the barley, and maybe there was like something that smelled bad in it, still wouldn't eat. They separated the chaff from the barley by hand. The donkey wouldn't eat. Pinchas ben Yair comes to the inn owners and says, is the barley tithed? Maybe it wasn't tithed. They tithed from the barley and the animal ate. He, Pinchas ben Yair, said, this poor animal is going to perform the will of its maker. And you're feeding it untithed produce? That's the context. That's actually what the story is. So always, so that we can, if we can unshare for a minute, right? The Talmudic stories like this is always important to look at the context, right? In some ways, what this story is really about for the rabbis is fulfilling God's will and making the point that we human beings are not the only ones who do that. All of creation has a mission. Everything that is created has a role, right? And we have a role too. We fulfill our mission or we don't. We are aligned with the natural world or we're not. But even animals, I probably shouldn't say even, right? We are not the only living creatures that have a sense of being commanded in some way by God. Now that actually opens an interesting question for Passover, right? And when we were talking about the Passover reader that we created, right? This is one of the things that I think is worth having a discussion about at the seder table is what do we think about this notion that we have a mission? Whether we think about the mission of humanity or the mission of the Jewish people or a mission of we ourselves as individual human beings. Do we feel called to something? How do we discern the will of our maker that both the donkey and the river are so sure of how to fulfill, but we human beings often are not, right? And it's one of the ways I think that the human being is unique, and is in that we have free will, right? One of the big themes of Passover is freedom. And its freedom refers both to freedom from, meaning we were brought out of slavery. We were brought out of oppression. We were freed from being strangers in a strange land, being slaves, and being oppressed. Those are the three characteristics of the experience in Egypt, right? Was gerut, being a stranger, avdut, being a slave, inui, being oppressed. We're freed from that. But we can't overlook the other part of God's challenge to Pharaoh over and over in the Passover narrative: let my people go that they may serve me, right? It's not only freedom from, it's freedom to. We're freed so that we can fulfill a mission. How do we know what that mission is? Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of my favorite theologians and Jewish writers, wrote very powerfully that man is a messenger who forgot the message. Right. And I think it's a very trenchant way of pointing out that one of the opportunities and tragedies of the human condition is that we alone, human beings, can fail to fulfill our purpose. A tree is always going to be a tree. It's going to live or it's going to die. It doesn't have free will. It will always be a tree. But human beings can be less than human. We can forfeit our humanity. We can compromise our humanity. We can become inhumane and in the process inhuman. Right? And that's very challenging. We have to remember the message and choose to fulfill it and deliver it. And so that's a different valence on the river's challenge to Pinchas ben Yair. As for me, I am certain of fulfilling my mission. Relating to you, it's a question. Maybe you'll fulfill it or not, right? When we read the story, I read that as maybe you'll succeed in redeeming these captives, or maybe you'll fail. Maybe the captors won't free them. Maybe something will happen on the way. But the river may be posing a different challenge, right? You may succeed in the larger project of being a human and being a Jew in the service of God, or you may fail. You may forget the message. You may commit terrible acts. You may, right? And that raises the question of which is preferable, right? Is it preferable to have a river where there is no doubt God's will be fulfilled? Or is it preferable to have human beings who have free choice? The story seems to suggest the latter. The river yields, right? And this is a way of thinking about the preciousness of free will, the preciousness of freedom in connection with service and mission, which is the fundamental distinction between freedom and license, right? Passover isn't celebrating license. We can do anything we want. No one's, right? As kids sometimes are, right? You're not the boss of me, right? Like, no one's the boss of me. I can do anything I want, right? No. Freedom the Passover is really about saying, wait, I'm obligated to something. And so I invite us to think about that question for the Seder. Like, what are our obligations? What are our duties? What do we owe? And do you think of them as a debt that you owe to God? Do you think of it as a debt that you owe to the Jewish people? A debt that you owe as a citizen of this country or another country if you're a citizen of a different country, right? Who are we indebted to and for what? And what are we celebrating, not just in terms of what we're freed from, but our ability to fulfill our obligations. Okay, so that's one sort of message I wanted to pull out of this text. There are a couple more, but let me pause here for a second. Any questions, thoughts, comments about that piece, fulfilling the
Again,
will of the
please
maker?
send your questions to me. I think for me, there's this question of, oh, this one's a good one. How many masters, in thinking about all of these different areas of obligation, how many masters can one serve without compromising one's integrity? You know, and,
It's a great question.
and there
And
is
what I
this
like to
challenge. You know, a
say,
river just has to do this one thing. That donkey just needs to, although the donkey actually does have two masters in this story, so maybe it's a little more complicated too.
it's a
Um,
fabulous question. And I want to say it goes to the essence, I think, of what it means to be a Jew and what it means to be a human being in the service of God. And that is that we do frequently, I wish I could say from time to time, it's a lot more frequently than that. We have competing obligations that we cannot always fulfill in their entirety. And we do have to make choices. That is the nature of being human. It's part of the grandeur of humanity, and it's part of the challenge and the pain of being a human being, right? And it happens in countless ways, whether we're a member of the sandwich generation with obligations to care for parents and obligations to care for children, whether we feel that we have conflicting obligations to the Jewish people and our role as citizens of the United States, whether we feel conflict in our obligations toward the people we love and religious commitments that we owe to God. There are countless ways in which our duties conflict. And what I like to say is we have to give up the fantasy of consistency, which will inevitably lead to, I think, distortions of our values and move toward coherence, which is different because it means that sometimes we're going to prioritize one duty over another. And at other times, we're going to reverse it and we're going to prioritize the second duty over the first because we're constantly weighing those challenges. And it's going to feel inconsistent and it's going to look to the outsider inconsistent. But we can strive for coherence, which means that we know what our commitments are, we know what our values are. And we sit in the struggle. We don't pretend there isn't a conflict and a struggle, and we make a choice and we live with it. And if it turns out that we later feel it was the wrong choice, we make a different choice the next time. And the next time we deal with the particularities of that context and what the contours of that decision demand of us in that moment. And it involves this constant struggle, which I think is another way of understanding the river's challenge to Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, right? You're a human being. Don't have the fantasy that you're always going to fulfill God's will, right? It's not possible for you all the time. Or I should say, maybe God's will for us is that we sit in the struggle and we have the courage of our choices. So that's a big question. We could do a whole seminar on that, which I'd actually love to do. Other thoughts before we go on?
I think we can continue.
Okay, great. Because I want to get to this question of the Arab traveler, right? Like I think the river staying split for the fellow Israelite, the fellow Jew who's getting the wheat for the Passover, he's engaged in a mitzvah, makes sense. But what about this Arab? How did this get into the story? So to get at this, we have, first of all, I want to show you there is a parallel text to this text. And lest you suspect that we are making too much of this fellow traveler, Most likely, the story that we read, which comes from the Talmud Bavli, right, the Talmud of Babylonia, which is the larger Talmud and the one that is it's more complete and it's the source of most of our halakha. There is a text in the Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel. Most likely, our text drew on this one and reworked it. And the earlier text is a very similar story, but not quite as tied to Passover. And it's a very particular and less universal story. And here it is. So in the Yerushalmi, we read, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair went to the house of assembly, the study hall, the synagogue, right? The place where everyone was gathered. But the Ganai River overflowed. And he said to the river, you hear the parallels, right? It's the same rabbi, it's the same river, and it's blocking his path again. He said to the river, Ganai, why do you prevent me from going to the house of assembly? I'm a great sage. I'm supposed to be there. You're blocking the path. And the river split before him, and he crossed. That's him. Now, his students, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair's students, ask their Rav, Pinchas ben Yair, may we cross also? The river split for you. Will it stay open for us? And he says to them, anyone who knows of himself, and here the students were likely all men, right? Anyone who knows of himself that he never mistreated a fellow Jew in his life may cross without being harmed. That's quite a challenge, right? Pinchas ben Yair says to his students, you want to know if you can cross safely? I'll tell you, right? Did you ever treat a fellow Jew, and the language here is dala akil. Akil is to treat someone lightly, not to take them seriously as a person, not to be respectful of them. Did you ever treat a fellow Jew casually, contemptuously, dismissively? If you didn't, you can get across safely. If you're not so sure, don't try it, right? Note the difference in the story. This has very few of the actual indicia of the Passover narrative, right? There's nothing about the wheat. There's nothing about captives. There's nothing about, right? It's just we're crossing water. And it's very particular. He doesn't say if you ever treated another person. It's a fellow Israelite. It's a fellow Jew. Barnash mi Yisrael, right? If you've been a good citizen of the people Israel and you've never treated anyone badly, you're fine. It's all about ethics. It's not about, there's no role of the divine will. That seems to be the original story. The rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud probably took this basic story, or a common sort of tale that this story also drew on, and they reworked it to say, no, we're making it really about Passover. We have a river splitting. Let's really evoke Passover. Let's really evoke the Exodus from Egypt. And they included this detail about this Arab traveling with them. Now, the big question about this, I mean, there's lots of questions about this Arab traveling with them, right? But one of the big questions is, what does Pinchas ben Yair mean when he says to the river, we have to let this man cross also, so that people not say, is this how they treat a fellow traveler? What does he mean by that? One sort of meaning, one way of reading this is and for now, let's unshare for a minute so I can see everybody. One way of understanding what he's meaning is, this is bad PR, right? Like, we can't have people saying about Jews that they treat non-Jews badly. This is obviously a message that we know nothing about in our time, right? That we're worried about like how what we do looks in the larger world and what that means for Jews. It's a problem, right? So he may be meaning that, like, we can't, for PR purposes, treat non-Jews who travel with us badly. That's bad. But I want to suggest that he may also mean something much deeper than that. And it may be related to his sense of fulfilling God's will. Is it only a PR issue? Or is he saying part of what it means to serve God is focused on how we treat others and not only Jews? We can't be concerned only for ourselves and leave the people who are traveling along with us behind. Right? This comes right back to, there was actually a debate about that Erev Rav, the mixed masses, the riffraff who came out with us in Egypt, from Egypt, right? There's actually a midrash in which God said to Moses, don't let them come. They're going to trip you up. And Moses says, what are you talking about? These are people who have begun to understand your message. They want to be close to you. How can we push them away? We have to take them with us. That's the debate, right? Here, we can arguably, Pinchas Ben Yair wants to say we owe obligations to our fellow travelers. Now, then the question is, who are our fellow travelers? That's a hard one to answer, right? What level of commonality and mutual commitment do we need in order to see someone as a fellow traveler? Do we take the minimalist position, meaning only the people who really share our values, who are committed to our well-being as we are committed to theirs, true allies, true partners, the people who are working with us to pursue the vision that we have as well? Or do we take a maximalist position? All of humanity are fellow travelers. There is one home, and it's the planet Earth, and we share it. And when we want to move forward in the world, in any way that we think about progress, that we think about healing, that we work toward good in the world, we have to take into account everybody. Because we're all traveling, hurtling through space together on this little planet, and we are all fellow travelers. And our fates are intertwined. That's just the reality. And so if we try to move forward, leaving people behind, A, we're not fulfilling God's will, and B, it's never going to work out. That's not the way redemption works, right? When we come out of Egypt, we have to take everybody willing to go. That's now, and this also I want to suggest would be a great conversation at the seder. Who do you see as the fellow travelers? What happens when we feel betrayed by people we saw as fellow travelers? Right? To whom do we owe those obligations? If we can just share the screen one more time, there's a couple of texts here that I wanted to show you that are really evocative on this question of what might Pinchas Ben Yair be saying. This is a classic text on the obligations that we owe to non-Jews, right? So one version is in the Talmud, which is here at the top. Our rabbis have taught, we support the poor of the Goyim, of the other nations, along with the poor of Israel, and we visit their sick along with the sick of Israel, and we bury their dead along with the dead of Israel. This, by the way, doesn't mean in the same cemetery, right? It means if someone has died and there is no one to attend to the burial, we attend to it, whether they're Jewish or not, right? Why do we do that? Mipnei darchei shalom, in the interests of peace. This seems to suggest a kind of PR issue, right? We want to have good relationships with the neighbors. We don't want to have conflict. We want people to think well of us. We have to treat them well. But if you look at what Maimonides did with this text, when he codified it in his Mishnah Torah, in his halachic compendium, he adds a proof text, which is very interesting. And he says, even with respect to Ovdei Kochavim, idolaters, the sages commanded us to visit their sick, to bury their dead with our dead, to maintain the poor with our poor, in the interests of peace, mipnei darchei shalom. Why? He quotes Psalm 145, which is Ashrei. We pray 3 times a day this line. Tov Adonai lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav. Adonai is good to all, and God's mercies are over all God's works. This is not PR and the practical issue of good relationships with neighbors. This is because God cares about everyone. So we have to care about everyone. God is compassionate and merciful with everyone. So we have to be compassionate and merciful with everyone. This is imitatio Dei. It's imitation of God. It's a religious value, right? So, and that is expansive. That's not just fellow travelers, the people we happen to be near. That's God cares about everyone, right? So that's in a nutshell what I want to suggest for how we think about in this fellow traveler, and to note that looking at the other text from the Yerushalmi, the source text, the rabbis went out of their way to include this Arab traveler. When they created this story and said, let's really make it about Passover, right? Like we have the story about the river parting. Let's make it about the Exodus story. Let's bring in the Passover week for the matzah. Let's bring in Moses crossing the Red Sea explicitly and make the comparison, right? Let's be it about redeeming captives. We'll do it up. We'll make the Passover story really come to light. They specifically added the non-Jewish traveler to the story. And we have to ask why, right? I think it's a way of raising the question at our Passover seders. Is the Passover narrative, is the Exodus narrative intended to be only about us? Or is it intended to be to teach a much bigger lesson? Right? So that's the second piece. And before I stop and we open it up for questions at the end, I wanted to just bring up one last point. And that's a little playful point, but I think it's a rich one for the Seder. So we scroll down to the last text. There's a requirement when we tell the story at the Seder. And it's in the Mishnah, and I brought you here the Talmud on it, that one begins with disgrace, the Hebrew is ganut, and concludes with praise. What is the meaning of with disgrace? And we have a debate. Rav said, in the beginning, mitchila uvdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu. Right? In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Whereas Shmuel says, when we talk about disgrace, it's avadim hayinu, right? At the Seder, avadim hayinu, right? So what do we mean by disgrace? Is it the shame of physical oppression? We were slaves, we were degraded. That's humiliating for us. And we start with that. The story has to begin there, and it ends with praise of God. Or do we mean, and this is also in the Seder, in the beginning, our ancestors worshipped idols, but Abraham, right, found God and left his father Terach, and right, and so the shame is not physical degradation, but spiritual degradation. We were once idol worshippers, and now we end the Seder in praise of God. Okay, so that's the rule about how you have to tell the story. I think it's fascinating that in this little story in the Talmud about Pinchas ben Yair and the river Ganai, the name of the river is so close to the word for shame or disgrace. Gnut. Ganai, Gnut. I'm sure it's coincidental. I don't think that it was an intentional play on words, but I think it's a very rich play on words. Because and we can, if we unshare so I can see everyone, right? One of the questions that I think is very trenchant and important at the Seder table is this question of what we do with our own shame and disgrace. What happens to it, right? We can hear in our story the image of Gnut becomes the river Ginai blocking our path. And I think it's an emotional, psychological truth that unresolved shame and humiliation can often block us from moving forward. I think it's been if you ask me personally, I think that unresolved humiliation and shame has been one of the great driving forces in the conflict in the Middle East since the beginning, right? Humiliation and the need for dignity, right? It often, unresolved humiliation blocks a future. And so the question is, here we are specifically commanded at the Seder to begin the story by speaking of our own sense of disgrace, laying it bare, right? Whether it's, here we are, hotshot sitting at the Seder table, like having, we've just koshered our homes. We're such, we're so committed. We're committed Jews. We're following the halakha. We're doing all this stuff. Yeah, we come from idol worshipers too, right? And by the way, probably most of us in our own lives have had moments where we shouldn't be so proud of our religious level, right? We can own that. Or we want to see it according to Shmuel, right? That it's the humiliation of having been a slave, right? That's us. That's our history. It's my history. And not only is that history supposed to instill in me empathy for others, but yeah, like it's I think it's embarrassing, right? You think about the generation immediately post Holocaust, nobody wanted to talk about it. Part of it is it's too difficult. Part of it was there was a sense of shame. How could I have been so weak? How could we have let this happen? How could we have been so vulnerable, right? What happens when that shame goes unexpressed? And what happens when we sit at the table and we create spaces that open the possibility to talk about it honestly? What does that open? What does it take to part the river Ginai, the river of shame that keeps us from moving forward, right? So it's another theme that, depending on kind of the intimacy of the people at your table, it's kind of a deep emotional thing to talk about. But in some families or groups of friends, that can be a very rich conversation. How does shame operate to keep us stuck personally, to keep us stuck as Jews? How is it functioning in American society? Right? The sense of humiliation that is unhealed and undiscussed. So I think I'll stop there and we'll open it up for some questions and comments and thoughts.
I love
It's a
that
lot.
in this. Oh, there are definitely comments and thoughts, and I'm sure I'm about to get more as you just said that. That I love that you just framed a way of looking at this from an internal community perspective, an external community perspective, and then an internal personal perspective. That this one story can give all of these different potential lenses. And maybe you want to use all three, or maybe you just want to use one or the other. But it's such a fascinating microcosm. So I think that there's this question on shame, how to address when shame comes from an event that may not have occurred, even though history is, I'm not sure I understood this. I thought I understood the question and then I didn't, but I'm going to throw it out there and we'll see where it goes. So how do we address these kinds of questions of shame when we're in this place of like historical question marks? Where the shame, where do we feel shame? Where do we not? That I think that's where the question is. And if I'm wrong,
so I would say regarding a question of shame, right? Beginning with shame, like that actual historicity is irrelevant. What is relevant is the sense of shame that we internalize. Sometimes when we voice it, we discover that we were actually wrong about the facts, right? And that what we internalized, I mean, it's much easier to talk about this on the personal level than the national level in terms of understanding it, right? That, if something happened in one's childhood that felt shameful, right? Sometimes when we talk about it, we actually hear from parents, if they're still alive, or siblings or others, like, really, that wasn't what was that. I'm so sorry you internalized it that way. That's actually not what I meant, or that's not how I perceived it. But what is relevant in terms of the river being blocking our path is how we internalized it and processed it. And that's true of others as well, right? When someone has experienced and processed something as deep humiliation, telling them they're wrong on the facts accomplishes very little, right? What needs to happen is a rebuilding of dignity and an honoring of the experience of shame. It's not about what was historically true. It's about how we encoded it in our personal or collective psyche, right? And it's deep work, right? It's not going to happen in one night at a seder. But I think it's worth at the seder thinking about what are the places of shame, both individually and collectively, that are blocking a path forward. And how can we be, here's the next step, how can we be agents of helping others heal and claim dignity and reclaim and re-experience a sense of dignity? Sometimes just being seen and acknowledged is enough. Maybe one or two more if we have time.
Yeah, so I think we have some notes on just the language because there's always this, but that someone is noting that the connection between Erev Rav and Aravi are interesting linguistically, and that maybe that they feel like your connection to these two or the rabbis is much more, it's right there in there. So, and I think there's some questions, there's challenge. This is not easy stuff. This is not, that we are putting out things that are challenging. So in thinking about this inclusive sense of responsibility, that what happens when there's not enough money or resources? How do we balance this kind of need for broad engagement with, our limited resources?
Yeah. It's really important, right? Both things. Like, first of all, that language of Erev Rav, right? The mixed multitude. It evokes also the language of the Hebrew for evening, right? Right, Erev. And they both come from a sense of mixed, right? The evening is the time of ambiguous light and darkness. The Erev Rav challenges us to think about ambiguities at the borders of who we consider us, right? It pushes us out of the notion that we can have a very clear boundary of us and them. The Erev Rav complicates that, right? It's mixed. And look, I think the reality, comes back to the question we had before about the duties that we owe, right? And oftentimes there aren't adequate resources, and it's not just money. There's a thing called compassion fatigue, right? We have limited attention of what we can, of the concerns that we can hold at any given time. We have limited compassion and we run out after a while, right? And obviously we don't have unlimited resources financially or simply in terms of time and space. And so we do have to make choices, and we do sometimes have to prioritize. But what I like to the way I like to think about it is we are called as human beings to live on two levels at once, and those two levels conflict and cause pain, and we just have to live with the pain. And the two levels are the practical level on which we work, the actions we take, the choices we make, the way we spend our time, the way we give our attention, the way we spend our financial and other physical resources, and what we hold in our consciousness as an ideal, right? There is very often a gap. That's part of the problem. As human beings, we can conceptualize much more than we can do. And so we live in the real world and we make choices, and we have to do that. And it means that we're going to support this cause and not that cause, right? We're going to decide what we're going to work on because we can't work on everything. We're going to decide who to give to because we can't give to everything. But we have to remain aware that there are, in fact, needs that we are not meeting, and those needs matter. There are people who we are not extending direct love to, and they are worthy of love, right? That's the challenge. And the Seder is an opportunity to hold both. It really is, right? The Seder is the moment when we recognize we are celebrating our redemption from Egypt. We are aware that our redemption came at the cost of another people's suffering and pain. And we remove a drop of wine from the cups because of the suffering of the other, right? We don't not celebrate Passover because it wasn't a complete redemption of the entire world and because the Egyptians suffered in the process, right? We still celebrate. But we consciously remember, don't forget, this was a partial redemption. Other people paid the price of our going free, right? That's an example of that move. We act on this level, we retain our consciousness at this level. I think that's the best I can.
No, I think that's actually, it is a brilliant way of contemplating seders, which are challenging, but also to give a framework for how to think through that challenge, that you can hold two things at one time. It's the both and, one of the myriad of both ands in Judaism.
Right.
So I want to thank you so much, Rabbi Uhrbach, for being here with us today, for sharing with us. I know for me, I plan on using bits from this at my Seder. I run the second night Seder in my family. And I'm very excited to see where those conversations around obligation and shame and, questions of what our responsibilities are, what that looks like with the be a 10, 11, and 12-year-old in our families.
Chag
So
Sameach, everyone. I just
Chag
want to wish
Sameach.
everyone a sweet and liberating Pesach.
Thank you so much for everyone for coming. Next week, we will be doing the intro on the MFA in creative writing. There will be an exciting announcement. Please join us at this time. And thanks to everyone. Please check out our High Holiday Reader and let us know how you use it. I'm interested to see what people are taking away. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your week.